Welcome back, Patreon supporters. I realized in the last few months that I should have been doing intros specifically for you. Less talking with me up front. You're not paying to hear me talk. You're paying to hear experts answer my questions about biblical studies. So I'll make this one much shorter than the other ones have been. Today's guest is Yakov Dolgopolsky-Geva, and we're going to talk about his essay, Where and When Did the Authors of Joshua 10, 1 through 39, and 11, 1 through 15 live? It appeared in the Journal of Biblical Literature, volume 142, number 1. I just want to let you guys know I really appreciate you. I appreciate the support that you provide. I'm going to try to do better about posting things on there about what I'm reading at the moment, just so you have an idea of where I'm going. I'm probably going to be dumping about 4 episodes on there today. So if you're listening to this, there should be 3 additional episodes accompanying it. And I have several more that are scheduled all the way up to episode 18. So this is episode 9, and I have 9 additional episodes that are either already recorded or scheduled to be recorded within the next few weeks. So I'm looking forward to that. Thanks again for your support. You guys are fantastic. Yakov Dolgopolsky-Geva. That is the last time I'm going to say your full name for the duration of the interview. Before we get started with my questions, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm an Israeli Hebrew Bible scholar. I teach at the Open University of Israel, as well as in the Gordon Academic College. I've done my PhD research at Hebrew University under the supervision of Professor Nili Vazana. I completed it in 2020, and I believe we're going to talk today about my article from JBL about Joshua 10 and 11. These are the most interesting chapters in the Bible, in my opinion.
Okay,
Well,
that's a
okay,
strong start.
maybe I didn't
No,
go
you
out there.
planted a flag. Leave it there. Okay, so where I want to start is actually at the end. So I'm going to read through your summation and then I'll have my question.
Okay.
But so you say the last 2 paragraphs of the article, you say, summing up the probable settings for the different stages in the textual development of 10, 1 through 39 and 11, 1 through 15 may be reconstructed as follows. The original narrative was a compilation of military accounts composed in the northern kingdom of Israel in the 8th century BCE, sometime before the Assyrian conquest of 722 to 720 BCE. So I'm going to stop there and just say, so I forgot to mention the name of the article is Where and When Did the Authors of Joshua 10, 1 through 39 and 11, 1 through 15 live? So jumping back to the front, you say this article challenges a common scholarly view regarding Joshua 10, 1 through 39 and 11, 1 through 15. So how far back does that common scholarly view go? Is that a traditional thing or is that a fairly modern thing?
No, it's a modern thing. It's not a traditional view. It's a modern scholarly near consensus. I would say that these 2 chapters, Joshua 10 and 11, as in fact the preceding chapters, Joshua 6 through 9, this is a Judean composition. This is usually attributed to the late 7th century BCE, around the time of King Josiah and his religious so-called reform. And being attributed to that period, or by some scholars to even a somewhat later period, Judean. Some scholars talk about these chapters, Joshua 6 through 11, if you like, and sometimes even more than that, maybe even Joshua 2 through 11. They speak about these chapters as a Deuteronomistic work, perhaps from the time of Josiah, and perhaps from a somewhat later period, say the Babylonian exile. This means that when you view these chapters as a Deuteronomistic piece of work, it means that prior to the time of King Josiah, there never actually existed conquest narrative, such as the one that we read in the book of Joshua today. There were perhaps just these scattered narrative fragments, and these are only the Deuteronomists. These are only Judeans of the 7th century BCE that invented a conquest narrative, invented this story, made it a story. So I challenge this. I think there are good reasons to suppose differently, at least about Joshua 10 through 11. And to be honest, if Joshua 10 and 11 are originally in an initial, earlier form, these chapters are somewhat earlier than the Deuteronomistic movement. If they are, in fact, from the northern kingdom of Israel before its destruction, that is, before 722 BCE, then it is much more likely that a conquest narrative already existed in that period, and that the Deuteronomistic editors of former prophets, the Deuteronomistic historiography is a piece of work that extends from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings. This is the common view. So the Deuteronomistic editors that created this big piece of work already had a conquest narrative at hand, already had a northern early conquest narrative, which they used as a sort of as an important tile in their mosaic.
So was this in either event, either your thesis or the thesis that you're writing against? Is this something that it transmitted orally and it's been written down? Or does that kind of view lend itself more to the idea that they were fragments that were then collected into a unified narrative? How do you see that, the
I'm not
origin
talking
of this
about
story?
oral. I'm not. Obviously, the origins of the story have to be some kind of a bucket of traditions that were rolling around. Perhaps some of them were connected initially to the concept of the conquest of the land of Israel by the Israelites, and potentially some of them were not. Some of these traditions were not connected to this concept, but came from different backgrounds in history. But obviously, some sort of an oral stage had to be there. But this is not the stage that I'm talking about here. Here I'm talking about a stage of written narrative text.
I've only just recently learned about how scrolls could be modified. So I'm just trying to take it step by step and see in evaluating these kinds of things. So you're solely concerned with the text. And is that just extant texts, or are you also thinking about how could this have been generated in a community, maybe in text that we don't have in front of us?
Yeah, I'm talking about the text that we don't have in front of us, the earlier
Okay,
forms
good.
of the text, which I try to reconstruct, and many other scholars do as well.
Okay, I don't want to make the assumption that it's one and not the other. So I was
Yeah, sure.
and for the listeners, there is no talk of oral transmission. That's just me trying to be thorough because I don't really know how the process works. So
No,
that
I'm talking
with
about textual transmission of scribal transmission, if you like. Yeah, not oral.
and so what we have in front of us with you evaluating, and this is really the fascinating part, like going into it, looking at the text, you're
Hmm.
evaluating adjacent cultures, how things
Hmm.
worked at that time, destructions of areas that we know. I am not, you wrote the article, so I'm not going to guide you as far as how you want to bring that up. But what is the pertinent data here? You organized it, but I'm not going to sit here and
Yeah,
read your article.
I'll say this: if we're trying to, I think that the most important, there are two contenders. This is not my contribution to the discussion, but I think that looking at past discussions about this issue, we're talking about two main historical backgrounds that are the best contenders for the role of being the background for the composition of this text. One is 8th century Northern Kingdom of Israel, pre 722 BCE, because by 722 BCE there was no northern kingdom anymore. And the second is the more commonly assumed 7th century BCE kingdom of Judah. What I basically did in this article is I tried to find in any place that in any way, in any detail that I have in within Joshua 10 and 11, uh, any potential hint to one of these backgrounds. Um, and I found, I think this is somewhat surprisingly, I found that there are quite a lot of hints towards a pre 722 BCE northern Israelite context. I would I would say the most prominent ones. First of all, the political reality that is reflected in this narrative. In both these chapters, 10 and 11, we have a coalition of local kings opposing an external force. The external force, that is the Israelite force, is much stronger than these locals. These locals gather and form a coalition that is, you can call it a coalition of peers or semi peers. None of them is another empire. None of them is not local. These are local Canaanite kings that form a coalition. One is led by the king of Jerusalem, and one is led by the king of Chatzor. The coalition of the south is led by the king of Jerusalem, and that of the north by the king of Chatzor. And they try to oppose the Israelites and, of course, fail terribly. Many scholars in the past noticed the fact that there is an interesting correlation between this pattern of military diplomatic action and the way local kingdoms in Syria and northern Israel, northern land of Israel, opposed the Assyrians in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE. It is quite common. We see it in mainly in the Assyrian inscriptions, descriptions of such coalitions. What I think scholars in the past either failed to notice or did not find important enough to note is that this pattern also disappeared. It did not last eternally, and the last coalition of this type in the ancient Near East took place in 720 BCE, 2 years after the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel. In later periods, similar coalitions always had to depend on an external force, usually Egypt, that would assist them. And these were not really local coalitions. These were more like these externally sponsored proxy coalitions that were actually taking care of the Egyptian interest much more than they would take care of their own interest. And in fact, within the 7th century BCE, such coalitions did not exist at all, which means that for an author living in the northern kingdom of Israel in the 8th century BCE, coalitions of this sort was something he saw on the news. For someone who lived in Judah in the time of Josiah, this was a historical memory as remote to him as World War One is remote to us. This is quite a difference. So this is, I think, a very strong argument to in support of Northern Israelite pre 722 BCE provenance. The surprisingly accurate information about Chatzor that appears in Joshua 11, two pieces of information that are historically accurate. One, that Chatzor was in fact the head of all those kingdoms. Chatzor, we know this from both from archaeology and from external non-biblical documents from the second millennium BCE. Chatzor was the leading city-state in Canaan, much stronger and much bigger and much more influential than any other. And indeed, it totally deserves that title of Chatzor, the head of all those kingdoms. Um, the second interesting piece of information is the fact that it was destroyed by fire. And it indeed was destroyed by a huge fire. Most of the scholarly debates about these accurate pieces of information revolve around the fact that uh, most details about Canaan and about Canaanite society within the conquest narrative in Joshua are very non-accurate. Usually, the information is completely false. There were no walls in Jericho, and Ai didn't exist at all, and Lachish was not destroyed in the right date. Everything just does not correspond to the information that we have outside biblical text. And here, surprisingly, about Chatzor, that is far away from the centers of Israelite culture, from Jerusalem or from Bethel. About Chatzor, we have this accurate information. Most of the scholarly debates about this were about the question whether this accurate information about Chatzor reflects historical memory. Then this is some sort of a problem if we look at the other details in the book of Joshua that do not reflect historical memory, um, or that they reflect some sort of some kind of correct interpretation of visible remains of Canaanite Chatzor. That is, that people in the First Temple period could visit Chatzor and see the ruins of the huge Canaanite city that once existed there. The Israelite Chatzor is much smaller, and the ruins of the huge Canaanite city are very impressive. So, if any of those were still visible above surface in the First Temple period, this could explain how people got to the conclusion that Chatzor was the head of all those kingdoms, and perhaps the remains of the fire were still visible. So the debates about these details are usually debates about whether they do or do not reflect historical memory. But I think we're all missing out on something quite incredible here. These are details about Chatzor. Chatzor was an Israelite city until 734 BCE, part of a region that was part of the northern kingdom of Israel. This means people from other regions of Israel, people from Samaria, from Bethel, or from could either visit Chatzor or they could meet people from Chatzor and get all the local Chatzor traditions from them and transmit them perhaps into written text. But in 734 BCE, Chatzor was destroyed by the Assyrians. The entire region, the entire Galilee region, is one of the regions that were incorporated into the Syrian Empire at that relatively early stage, and Chatzor was never rebuilt. People from Judah in the 7th century BCE could not visit Chatzor personally. Probably they could not. It was outside the border, and there were no people of Chatzor to meet. There was no one to get the traditions from. So the existence of these accurate details about Chatzor, I think, are also a very good sign towards northern Israelite provenance. There is more, but I think these are two good examples of what I see as important evidence in this argument, in this debate.
So you're saying, and I'm not gonna pronounce it the same way. Hazor, is that okay? To
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, sure.
okay. So the fact that if you want to date as the people that you're debating with, if you want to date it to the 600s BCE, what you're running into, yeah, in Judah or in Judea,
Yeah.
what you're running into is there's no reason to think they would know about it, and they wouldn't
Mhm.
know anybody who knew anything about it. It would be like someone talking about the Prussian Empire, which wasn't even a thing when my grandfather was born, let alone for me. I'm not telling stories, which actually goes to the idea that no matter what someone
I would
believes
take it.
about the
I would
text,
take it even more radically. It's just imagine that Berlin would have been a deserted heap of stones for some horrible reason, and you couldn't even meet anyone from the capital of the Prussian Empire to
okay,
tell you stories, to tell you any local stories about it.
So it's almost like the underlying idea there is whoever's telling this story without any information is not telling an honest story that even they think is honest. Whereas the dating that you have, even if there's some remove from that place, they could know these things and this area. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would say that this is a huge challenge anyway. You look at it to understand how these stories ran into the book of Joshua. And this is an especially tricky question because other details about Canaan have completely escaped the knowledge of these authors. So it's almost I think it's almost demanded to understand that something about these details about regarding Chatzor is different from what happens in other parts of the book of Joshua. And I think I find no better explanation than to say someone someone was able to get local traditions from Chatzor, local traditions about the history of this city. Just know these two details: the detail about Chatzor being the head of all those kingdoms and Chatzor being burned by fire. These are not really details about the conquest. These are details about the place itself. I would say it's either locals had these local traditions which they preserved, and someone had to run into a local Chatzor guy and get the story from him. And I'm trying to understand in what world could a biblical author meet a guy from Chatzor. This is not a banal meeting. Or the other possibility is that there were no local historical traditions, but rather people who visited Chatzor could speculate about physical remains that can be seen in Chatzor. They could look at the ruins of the city and say, this once was probably the greatest city in Canaan. And they could look at the remains of the fire and say, this city was probably burned by fire. And yet, someone has to go to Chatzor and see these remains. Who is more likely to go to Chatzor? Is it an 8th century BCE North Israelite guy or a Judean from the 7th century BCE? I do have to say that there are also signs that attest to Judean provenance within Joshua 10 and 11. But when looking carefully at these signs, I think it seems quite clear that they come from relatively later layers of text that are by the critical analysis of the text, they seem like they seem like a later editorial layer.
Can I? Can I? Okay, so explain what you mean by that, and let me set up why I'm asking for the listeners. So
Hmm.
I'm 40 years old. My whole life I've had access to books. If you change something in a book, I'm going to
Hmm.
notice and it's going to look
Hmm.
like you're corrupting it. Is that the same situation with the texts that you're talking about?
Probably not. There are a few reasons why probably not. First of all, and one person having access to two copies of the same book is a very rare situation before the invention of print. This is you would have one. Okay? Actually, being able to, as a reader, being able to confront two versions is difficult. But I do want to go a little deeper than that and say perhaps the text was an important text. Perhaps even it was canonized. Perhaps even I'm not sure it was, but perhaps it was even already in ancient times in the First Temple period. Perhaps it was already considered a religious, a sanctified text. Maybe. Uh, let's assume all these things. And if we assume these things, this means people were looking into the text and wanting to make sure that the text is not, as you say, corrupt. Text critical studies, that is, studies that focus on the differences between existing versions of the same text. In the case of biblical studies, we're talking about studies that focus on the differences between the Masoretic text, our Hebrew canonized text, and the different versions of its Greek translation, the Septuagint, and the existing fragments we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls of the same text. These text critical studies show very clearly that as late as the Second Temple period, probably until the very end of the Second Temple period, as late as the first century BCE or maybe even first century AD, these holy books did have different versions. These sacred books did have probably each one of these books that we have contained in the Hebrew Bible today had in the Second Temple period quite a few different versions. 4, 5, 6, 10, who knows? We have just a bit that survived. It appears that at least as far as adding up to a text, this was not considered in the Second Temple period. It was not considered something you're not allowed to do with a sacred text. You're allowed to add on to it. It is much more questionable whether you were also allowed to cut out a piece of text. It seems many of the edited biblical books come from or developed through a process of people wanting to preserve as much holy text as possible. So if you have two different versions, you would put both in. And you have two sentences that say the same thing. If you have two different flood stories, put them both in. Two different creation stories,
And
put them both in.
and we're
And
not
if
until
yeah,
pretty late in the game. We're not talking about books, right? We're talking about scrolls,
scrolls.
which function differently than books, right?
Yeah, you mean technically, in the
Well,
sense of
if you
how
want
you
it,
cut and paste it, or
because it wouldn't really be cutting and pasting so much, would it? It would be you're making a
there's a
copy, and I
there's a
want to
question
incorporate
here.
this, and I want to. Okay.
There's a
Oh,
question.
then yes,
If you want a recommendation for another scholar for your podcast,
absolutely. We'll
there is a
save that.
cut and paste theory. There is a literally cut and paste theory, but it's not really the question is not whether the question that you're asking, if I understand correctly, is not the question whether they cut and paste it physically. It's rather the question whether they felt it's okay to take a text and just add a paragraph onto it.
The whole
So
thing. It is also the logistics of it because I think
mhm,
for a contemporary Western reader of books, it looks a
mhm.
lot more nefarious to add something to a book. Wait, why are they doing this? Even with Bibles, where they realize the extant copies that we have, we need to put a footnote because maybe this passage is missing or something, but we'll footnote it. And people think there's a conspiracy afoot. Something's going on. They don't want us to read this. And
One
what
of
you're
the
saying is,
yeah
sorry, go ahead. You say what you're saying. I don't need to say what you're saying.
one of the speculations. This is really not my speculation, and so, but I will mention it. One of the ways in which some scholars assume text would be expanded is in not footnotes, but rather more side notes or in between the lines notes that later copiers mistake to be a part of the text. Um, a side note can enter the text. We see this in the Middle Ages. We see this in the history of manuscripts. We see this phenomenon from time to time. But I think probably what we're talking about in the case of Joshua 10 and 11 is these are really two editions of the text, that Northern Israelite edition and the Judean 7th century BCE edition. These are two different editions of these chapters that have to do with the creation of larger units of text. That is, this is not something I can prove, this is speculation, but I do suppose that the original Northern Israelite version of Joshua 10 and 11 was the concluding episode of a conquest narrative that stood on its own, a piece of work that was composed in the northern Israelite kingdom in the 8th century BC and stood as it was. Um, the later version of the text is already part of a much larger piece, probably the Deuteronomistic history, that large piece of text extending from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings. So, what we're actually looking at is an early text, an early, relatively short text, perhaps extending from Joshua 6 to 11, or maybe including also something from the first chapters of Joshua, but probably something like that, roughly Joshua 6 through 11. And this piece was taken by a later editor that wanted to create a much larger work. He wanted to write a history of the people of Israel from from their last days in the desert, that is Deuteronomy, until the destruction of the first temple in 2 Kings. In order to create this big piece, he was looking for earlier works that could serve him. He was looking for, he was looking through his library for any history of the conquest. And he found a very nice story about the conquest, a northern Israelite story, and he incorporated it into his larger work. But he didn't just put it in as it is. While incorporating it into the larger work, he also expanded it and added elements that seemed right for him. Perhaps he also had his own traditions that he threw in. This is, again, speculation. But this is what I think we're actually looking at. So this is not just someone taking the text and expanding it. It's actually taking a text and putting it into a new literary context. This is, I think, the motivation in this case.
So there's someone making an editorial decision that's a much more reasonable and plausible, and I would even say a charitable interpretation of what the text you have in front of you is,
Mhm.
than saying, oh, the authorship happened way later, which is what the thesis you're debating was saying, right?
Still much later, we're talking about things that happened around the 1200. That if they happened, the conquest of Palestine by the Israelites, if it happened in around 1200 BCE, to say the original form of the text is from the 8th century BCE and not from the 7th century BCE, this is not really making it closer to the events or more historically.
No, it seems an oversimplification to just say, oh, the authorship must have happened at this later point when there's so much to it that's not just authorship. That there's so this chunk of the story was maybe authored on its own, had it was not incorporated into a whole until later,
Mhm.
uh, but that it comes from a tradition that's telling a story that was not initially intended to be told in this larger story, but in a story. Does that? I don't. Maybe I'm not
Yeah,
asking. Or
something like that. Yeah, it seems that the
okay,
Israelites in general, Northern Israelites, Judeans as well, had this tradition, had these traditions about having conquered their land in ancient times from other peoples, other nations that lived here. And we have, it appears, by the way, that we have two different conquest narratives. One is the more famous one in Joshua, that is a far more extended one, detailed. This is the one that we're usually looking at. But actually, we have another one at the beginning of the book of Judges. Judges 1 through 2:5, I'd say. Yeah, Judges 1:1 through 2:5 is actually a parallel, much shorter, less detailed, parallel conquest story. It starts as if the story in Joshua never happened. It describes the conquest of Palestine as a whole. It is not as impressive as the one in Joshua, especially in the sense that it focuses a lot on territories the Israelites are said to have not conquered, to have failed in conquering. It puts much more emphasis on Judah, that is the tribe of Judah, that is almost absent from the conquest narrative in Joshua. And I would guess that this is actually the originally Judean version of the conquest. So they had two stories. There was one, a northern Israelite one, much more impressive, pretty lame Judean one, and the editor of the larger work of the Deuteronomistic history had access to both, and he wisely decided to put the Israelite one before the Judean one because it's much more impressive.
Impressive and unifying, right? Like it sets a very clear picture that we as a people, all right,
It's
did
impressive
this.
in this sense, yes, that we are one nation conquering the land as one. There are no in the conquest. There are no tribes. Everyone takes part. There are also no real failures. Everything is conquered. There is, and this is quite horrible actually, but there is a very a complete form of that horrible practice that appears in the Bible a few times of cherem, of a ban, which means complete annihilation of a conquered city or territory. In the case of the conquest of Canaan, it is told that the entire land of Canaan was banned. That is, that except for a few outstanding survivors, such as the family of Rachav from Jericho, Rachav the harlot, and the Hivites from Givon that were able to trick the Israelites, save these few outstanding cases, the entire Canaanite population was killed. And horribly enough, this was considered, in the eyes of the Deuteronomistic editors, this was considered a positive feature. This was in agreement with the Deuteronomistic ideology. So it's much more impressive in the sense that there are no failures, there are no, almost no sins in this story. The people of Israel just obey the Lord and do what the Lord tells them to do, and everything goes well. Um,
And they get the land,
and they get the land, and there's
in retrospect,
in retrospect, from the point of view of a Deuteronomistic history, of a long history, they get the land, and they get a fresh start. So, for a narrative that is mainly concerned with what will happen with this nation in the future, that is, in the time of the judges and in the time, mainly in the time of the kings, this is a very good fresh start to start sinning from. To see that we got all that, and still we were so unjust that eventually we got kicked out of our land.
man, it's so. I want to gush over you and your colleagues for a minute. So to explain to the listeners, you if you're if you're doing this job of biblical studies in an academic way, you're sifting through texts and finding that, oh, they didn't all come down together. They
Mhm.
got compiled at some point, and they are all both telling a larger story, and we're identifying places where someone was telling a smaller piece of a story, and so we're figuring how that piece that we've identified fits into this larger story, but
Mhm.
also trying to determine how historically the people who actually started to tell that story,
Yeah.
what world they lived in, when did they do,
Mhm.
to cite the title of your article, where and when,
Yeah.
because that really matters. It matters where they lived and when they lived, because now we know the intention of this chunk of the story in
Mhm.
relation to the larger
Yeah.
Deuteronomistic. Is that okay? I really appreciate that there are people out there like you doing that. I picked
Fine.
up on a parallel. Okay, the episode won't come out until October, but Jody Magnus published an article about toilets and toilet humor and the story of Eglon's murder by Ehud. And
Mhm.
she's evaluating the site at Lachish. I believe I said that correctly. And Lachish, so the gates
Sure.
there,
Mhm.
and she's pointing out that the original archaeological survey that was done there, they missed a lot of things and they maybe didn't do great
Mhm.
work. So what I'm wondering here for Hazor, say,
Hmm.
Is there recent information that you have, that you and your peers now have, that maybe they didn't have back then, that they didn't understand how significant that destruction was?
What do you mean by back then? Back.
So to not factor the destruction of Hazor and the timing that was into a thesis that says, oh no, this was written in the 7th century by
Hmm.
Southern people
Yeah.
rather than by Northern people. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
I'd say that I'm not the only. I'm not the only one that thinks that there was a northern Israelite conquest story before 722 BCE, and that Joshua 10, or at least Joshua 11, somehow attest to it. I'm not the only one that thinks that. I do think that the significance of these details about Chatzor have escaped scholars. I think it's the fact that the focus has always been, these details have been known for quite a few decades now. Okay, there's nothing new about our knowledge that Chatzor was indeed destroyed by great fire, that it was indeed the head of all those kingdoms. But the debates around these details have always evolved around the question of historical memory. That is, it was labeled as the case that puts into question the assumption that there is no historical memory in the book of Joshua. Maybe there is historical memory. And then scholars try to find a way to explain these details without historical memory, to explain them as a correct interpretation of visible remains in Chatzor. But the significance of this information to the provenance of the text, this was somehow missed. I can't really tell you, I can't really speak on behalf of the scholars who missed it, but I think there is not enough focus on matters of space and geography in biblical studies. So many details that have to do with the geographical background are not looked at carefully enough. This is perhaps some sort of heritage that we have in modern biblical studies from 2,000 years of interpretations of the text by people who never visited the land of Israel. And thinking about these texts as universally relevant sacred texts takes them out of local context. So I think many details about geography and spatial matters are not looked at enough in biblical studies. So I would guess this is the reason. It's not the same scholars who looked at these details. Archaeologists and historians were very interested in the question whether there is historical memory there, and didn't really care about the question whether the text is from the 7th, 8th, or 6th century BCE, as far as they're concerned. And Bible scholars didn't really notice the significance of the geographical setting.
Which seems like a
which
really
which is great for me
foundational
because
aspect
otherwise
of
I would
reading a
have nothing
text.
to write about. What?
I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. I think you could just do an even better job at doing a better job if they had done a better job. Because there's just the texts alone, evaluating the texts, it's pretty recent that they found new and this is going to sound weird, new older copies that weren't available within our
Yeah,
lifetimes.
but I do have to be clear about this. These versions of the text, these editions of the text, which I'm talking about, are not existent. These are not. Uh, these are not copies of the text that we actually have. These are only reconstructed editions that I try
Hypothetical.
to reconstruct. Yeah,
I just
as
meant simply from the point of view of you doing biblical studies, there are additional
mhm.
biblical texts that previous
Yeah,
generations hadn't had. So you still would have had
yeah,
work to
yeah.
do. I just don't want you to feel like you'd be unemployed if it weren't for these people making what you're saying now, and I think plausibly so, are mistaken readings of the text because they're not taking into consideration literal facts on the ground, like where was this place, what happened to it, did it exist when you're saying it, like all of this stuff happened. That's
Yeah.
pretty important. And the spatial familiarity, which I thought was an
Yeah.
interesting term. And it sounds like
Mm.
something that has pretty broad implications for ancient
So
text in general.
I certainly
I'm
hope
sorry,
so.
say
This
that.
spatial familiarity was my great aim in my doctoral dissertation. The significance of spatial familiarity to assessing provenance.
Unfortunately, we got cut off here. I don't think, because I don't have the recording, I'm not entirely sure. I don't think that he had a whole lot more to say. I think we had wrapped it up around this period just based on what I did get of my file retrieved. Be that as it may, I do want to add he didn't get to answer the question of who are the authors or people that he thinks the listeners should be looking out for in the biblical studies world. So he recommends Shirley Natan Yulzari, Ariel Seri Levy, and Idan Dershowitz. I will be looking into them and making sure that I have something added in the show notes in case listeners are interested. I really apologize. It is one of those fluke things. I'm not sure how it happened. It hasn't happened since. I will try to figure out how to make sure it doesn't happen on purpose, not just out of luck. So once again, I appreciate you guys. You guys are really helpful just for moral support, backing me on Patreon. Thank you.